The part that still makes my stomach tighten is how calmly I wrote the admission note, like the words themselves could keep a distance from what had already happened. My name is Daniel Mercer. I've worked pediatric inpatient psych for a little over 9 years. At the time of this admission, I was assigned to a short-term crisis unit locked. 6 beds, mostly stabilization and safety planning. My shifts were evenings, usually 3 p.m. to 11:30 p.m. Intake, observation, documentation, de-escalation when needed. Nothing unusual. He came in late, just before the night shift crossover. Small for his age. Thin arms, old sneakers, hoodie zipped all the way up even though it was warm on the unit. His parents did most of the talking. He stood slightly behind them, eyes moving, taking everything in. The referral paperwork listed escalating behavior at home. That phrasing shows up a lot. It rarely means what people think it does. During intake, I asked the standard questions: orientation, mood, sleep, appetite. He answered politely briefly. No visible agitation, no psychosis. When I asked about harming animals, he didn't deny it. He just said, sometimes, the way kids talk about skipping homework. The parents filled in the details. Neighborhood cats, 1 dog. The way they said it was strange, not minimizing, exactly, but not alarmed either. As if this was something they'd been hoping would pass on its own. I remember thinking that someone had waited too long to be afraid. The incident that finally brought them in had happened 2 nights earlier. They told it quietly, almost embarrassed. They'd been asleep when they felt the mattress dip between them. A heavy downward pressure. When they woke, he was standing there, holding a large kitchen knife closer to a cleaver than anything else, embedded straight down into the bed, right between their bodies. Not slashing, not swinging, just planted there. They said he was awake, fully aware. When they asked him what he was doing, he told them he wanted to kill them to see if their insides looked like the cat's. He said the cat's name out loud, casually, like it was a comparison anyone would understand. When I asked him about it directly, later, he didn't show fear or shame. He said, I didn't get to finish last time. That was all. We placed him on close observation. 15-minute checks, no sharps access, door open, the usual precautions that are supposed to feel reassuring. He complied with everything. Ate dinner, showered when prompted, asked what time lights out was. At one point while I was charting, he asked if I wrote down everything or just the bad stuff. I told him I wrote what was relevant to safety and care. He nodded, like that answered something for him. There was a moment during evening rounds that hasn't ever sat right with me. I checked on him around 9:40. He was sitting on the bed, hands flat on his thighs, staring at the wall. Not distressed, not dissociative, at least not in any obvious way. I asked how he was feeling. Normal, he said. I marked it down calm, cooperative. Later, during handoff 2 nights, I went over his history, his presentation, the incident at home. I used clinical language. Targeted threat, intent expressed, no remorse observed. The night staff nodded. We've all heard worse. As I was leaving, I passed his room again. He was lying down, eyes open, still facing the wall. I told him goodnight. He didn't respond. A few days later, during treatment team, one of the psychologists mentioned something he'd said in session, that he'd known exactly where his parents would be lying because he'd watched them sleep before, that he'd practiced with smaller things first. Animals don't move the same way. No one reacted visibly. We all just wrote it down. He was transferred out after a week to a longer-term facility. Appropriate placement, higher level of care. That's how the case officially ends. But sometimes, when I think about him, it isn't the violence that comes back first. It's how easy it was to document, how familiar the process felt, how many boxes there were to check that didn't quite fit what I was seeing, and how young he was, standing there in his parents' bedroom, holding something meant to cut meat, wondering out loud if people looked the same inside. I still remember the way the room went quiet when she said it. Not abruptly, just the kind of quiet that settles when everyone stops typing at once. I'd been working in patient psych for just over 11 years at that point, mostly adult acute admissions. That night I was assigned to intake and observation paperwork, initial assessments, keeping an eye on anyone waiting for a bed upstairs. It was just after 2 a.m., the hour when people are tired enough to stop embellishing their stories and careful enough to choose their words. She was in her early 30s, brought in voluntarily by family. No agitation, no obvious psychosis, clean clothes, good eye contact, flat but appropriate affect. She sat straight in the chair across from me, hands folded, answering questions in complete sentences. I remember thinking, briefly, that this one would probably end up being a short stay. We were going through developmental history, the part most patients rush through: school, friends, any behavioral issues as a child. I asked the question the same way I always did, neutral, almost automatic. She paused longer than usual, then said there had been an incident when she was young. She framed it clinically herself, like she'd practiced. She told me she was 3 years older than her sister, that when the baby came home, she'd been moved out of her crib. She said that part calmly, but she watched my face when she said it, as if checking whether I understood the importance of that detail. According to her, her mother noticed the house had gone quiet one afternoon, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel right. When she went into the bedroom, she found her standing next to the crib, trying to climb in. She was holding a handheld can opener, the kind with a pointed tip, not waving it, not hiding it, just holding it, like a tool. Her mother asked what she was doing. She told me her answer, without changing her tone. She said she wanted to open the baby's head, to see what was inside. She didn't smile when she said it. She didn't look embarrassed or amused. She spoke the way patients do when they're recounting something factual, something already categorized in their own minds. I noticed my pen had stopped moving. I made myself write again, even though I wasn't sure what box that sentence belonged in. I asked how old she'd been. She shrugged and said young. I asked if she remembered feeling angry. She said no, just curious. She added that losing the crib mattered more than losing attention. She said that part like it was obvious. There were no reports of follow-through, no injuries. Her mother intervened in time. The family never talked about it again, she said. It was treated as a strange childhood moment. Kids can be creepy. Her relatives would joke later, apparently. She told me this without bitterness. I asked the standard follow-ups. Any other incidents involving harm to others? Any history of cruelty to animals? She answered carefully, choosing not exactly instead of no. I didn't press further than protocol allowed. Intake isn't the place for confrontation, and nothing she was saying met criteria for immediate escalation. What stayed with me was how she described the object. Not a knife, not scissors. A can opener. Chosen, she said, because it would work better. That was the first time that night I felt something tighten in my chest. I finished the assessment, assigned observations, documented her statements as neutrally as I could, stripping them of tone, reducing them to phrases that would fit in a chart. Childhood incident, inappropriate curiosity, no expressed remorse. Insight limited, but present. When I handed off to the next nurse, I didn't mention the story out loud. There was nothing actionable in it, nothing that would change her level of care. But later, during hourly rounds, I found myself checking her door more often than necessary. She was always asleep, breathing evenly, hands relaxed at her sides. I've heard worse stories in that unit. I've charted far more violent behavior. But this one never resolved itself neatly in my head. There was no illness to point to, no episode to contain it within. Just a small child, quiet in a house, standing at a crib with a tool and a question. Even now, I don't know where that belongs. I only know that sometimes, when a ward goes very still in the early hours, I think about that kind of quiet, and I make sure to keep walking. It was the silence that made me check on him. Not a profound silence. The unit is never truly quiet, but a specific one. The absence of a particular sound. Mr. Davison, in bed for room 7, was a chronic catatonic, schizophrenia, undifferentiated. He'd been with us for 8 years. His routine was bedrock. He would sit in the reinforced vinyl chair by his window from 7 o'clock until 9 o'clock. Perfectly still, one hand flat on the armrest, the other in his lap. And every 45 minutes, like a slow metronome, he would tap his index finger against the chair's arm. Tap. You could set your watch by it. I'd been a night shift RN on this long-term observational unit for 11 years. My job, from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., was to make half-hourly visual checks, document vitals at 2 o'clock, and ensure the calm continued. It was procedural. You learn the sounds of the placed hum of the fridge at the nurse's station, the particular sigh of the hydraulic door to the sanitation closet, the tap of Mr. Davison's finger. That night, at 2:11 a.m., I was finishing the vitals log. I realized I hadn't heard the tap for over an hour. It wasn't an alarm. It was a vacancy. I walked down the hall. The safety glass in his door showed his silhouette in the chair, backlit by the perpetual dim hall nightlight. Still, I entered quietly, not wanting to startle him if some new phase had begun. He was staring straight ahead, out the darkened wire-reinforced window. His right hand was on the armrest, but still, no tap. I was about to speak his name, a standard check for responsiveness, when I saw his left hand. It was in his lap, as usual, but it was moving. Slowly, deliberately, the tip of his index finger was tracing something on the fabric of his trousers. Over and over. I took a step closer. He gave no indication he knew I was there. His breathing was shallow, his eyes unfocused, but his finger moved. I recognized the pattern after the third repetition. It wasn't random. He was writing. A single, looping word, traced again and again. Lydia. I pulled his chart. He'd been admitted after a catastrophic breakdown following the stillbirth of his daughter. The records were old, typed. The child's name was not listed. Only the clinical notation. Traumatic grief reaction compounded by latent psychotic disorder. The next night, during my 11 o'clock round, I paused at his door. The tap had resumed. Tap, tap, tap. Regular. I felt a stupid, profound relief. I chalked it up to a transient motor mannerism, a coincidence of the word's shape. I didn't document it. What would I write? Patient traced a common female name. It was meaningless. 3 nights later, the new admission came in. Agitated dementia, transferred from St. Catherine's Hospice. We got her settled in room 9, a low stimulation room. Her name was on the intake form, the one I clipped to the master board at the station, Lydia. An 82-year-old woman with advanced pancreatic cancer, now presenting with acute delirium. A coincidence. A statistical fluke. I told myself that. But at 4 o'clock, after her sedative had finally taken effect, I walked past Mr. Davison's room. The tapping had stopped again. Through the glass, I could see his profile. He wasn't looking out the window. His head was turned, just slightly, toward the hallway, toward room 9. His hand was in his lap. He was tracing again. I never mentioned it to Dasheft. I never put it in a note. What good would it do? To suggest a man who hasn't spoken in 8 years, who hasn't reacted to anything, somehow new. It violates every protocol, every rational understanding of his condition. It's not evidence of anything. But I changed my check pattern after that. I don't let myself listen for the tap anymore. And I can't look at his left hand. Sometimes, the horror isn't in what breaks. It's in what remains intact and functional behind the wall. Working silently, knowing things. The first thing I noticed was the handwriting. It wasn't wrong. It just wasn't mine. I was working admissions that month, temporary assignment, after a staffing reshuffle. 10 years in by then, mostly nights, mostly locked units. Intake is quieter than the ward, but heavier in a different way. You take people at their worst moment and decide, quickly, how much danger they are to themselves and everyone else. That evening shift started at 6 p.m. I relieved a day admissions nurse I trusted. We went through the log together. Standard stuff: 1 voluntary hold pending evaluation, 1 involuntary transfer scheduled for later. At the bottom of the intake sheet was a completed risk assessment for a patient who hadn't arrived yet. Name, age, provisional diagnosis, even a brief mental status exam. I asked her if she'd started pre-charting again. She looked at the page, frowned, and said she hadn't. We both laughed it off. Charts get messy during shift overlap. Someone probably jumped ahead in the system. I crossed a line through the entry and initialed it clean slate. At 7:42 p.m., EMS radioed in male patient, mid-40s. Picked up after being found sitting in traffic, non-responsive but awake. No resistance, no substances, no ID. When they wheeled him in at 8:01, my stomach tightened. He matched the chart I'd crossed out, down to the scar noted on the left forearm. I asked the paramedic if they'd called ahead earlier. They hadn't. The patient didn't speak. He followed instructions, slowly but accurately. Sat when asked. Extended his arm for vitals without prompting. Eye contact minimal but present. During intake, I asked the standard orientation questions. Name, date, location. He didn't answer. I documented selective mutism versus catatonic features and moved on. You don't force conversation in that state. When I opened his electronic chart to start fresh, the crossed-out assessment was back fully entered. Time-stamped 6:18 p.m., authored by me. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. System errors happen. Autofill glitches. I logged out and back in. Still there. I scrolled. Under patient statement, a single line had been documented. I don't speak until I'm sure who's listening. That wasn't my language. Not clinically, not ethically. I asked him again if he knew why he was there. He looked at me just briefly, then down at his hands. You already wrote it, he said. His voice was calm. Normal volume, no affect. I asked him what he meant. He nodded toward the computer. I pulled the chair back slightly. Not enough to be obvious. I asked him if he could tell me his name. He shook his head. I'll lose it again, he said. That happens. I called the charge nurse and requested a secondary assessment. Policy backed. No panic in my voice. While we waited, I continued the checklist. Suicide ideation. Hallucinations. Delusions. No, he said to each. Then, after a pause, not the way you mean it, at 8:26, I noticed something else. The timestamps on the chart entries weren't sequential. My initials appeared on notes logged during hours I hadn't worked. Overnight notes. Weekend entries. All brief, all vague. Patient observed resting. Minimal response to stimuli. Language we all use. Language that could belong to anyone. Except I could recognize my own shortcuts, my phrasing. I asked him how long he'd been coming here. He said, as long as you have. That wasn't possible. I'd checked his history. No prior admissions. No records in the system. When the charge nurse arrived, he stopped speaking entirely. Wouldn't respond even when she asked directly. She reviewed the chart and didn't see what I saw. The extra entries didn't appear on her screen. We admitted him for overnight observation. At 10:14 p.m., while I was finalizing paperwork, a new note populated, authored by me. Patient remains quiet. Will speak when it's safe. I logged a system incident report. IT followed up the next week. No breach, no duplication, no explanation. The patient was transferred out the next morning. Still mute, still compliant. Before transport, he looked at me and said, very softly, next time, Check the handwriting sooner. There hasn't been a next time, not with him, but sometimes, when I open a new chart, there's already a sentence waiting, and it always sounds like me, only more certain than I ever feel. I used to think night observation was the safest assignment. No admissions, no discharges, just watching, charting, and keeping people from hurting themselves while the rest of the building slept. By my 12th year, I'd done enough crisis work to welcome the quiet. This was the geriatric psych wing. Locked, low stimulation, 8 beds. I worked 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. as the observation unit supervisor, 1 tech under me, 1 float nurse covering meds across 2 floors. My responsibility was eyes on verification every 15 minutes. Every round documented, no exceptions. At 11:47 p.m., I signed in and reviewed the board. Bed 3 was new, female, early 70s. Dementia with behavioral disturbance, transferred from medical after repeated nighttime agitation. High fall risk, no history of violence. The day supervisor left a note in red. Patient reports being awake during checks, possibly confabulating that didn't stand out. Patients in that unit often believed staff were missing rounds. Time slips, misinterpretations, nothing sinister. My first round was at 12 o'clock on the dot. Lights low. All patients in bed. Bed 3 was awake, eyes open, hands folded on her chest. I paused long enough to see her breathing. She didn't move, didn't speak. I documented awake.com. At 12:15, same position, same stillness. At 12:30, same. By 1 o'clock, I started paying closer attention. Dementia patients don't usually hold still that long when they're awake. There's usually something fidgeting, murmuring, eye movement. She was perfectly composed, like she was posing for a photograph. At 1:14, she spoke. "You're early." I stopped just outside her doorway. That phrase again, early. It has a way of tightening your shoulders in this job. I told her I was right on time. She smiled, not warmly, more like politely. "You don't come at 14, she said. "You come at 15. I didn't answer that. I stepped in, checked her wristband, adjusted the blanket routine grounding behaviors. She watched my hands carefully. I asked her if she knew where she was. "In the place where you pretend not to see," she said. I charted nothing from that exchange. Dementia, behavioral phrasing. You learn to filter. At 1:30, I did the round with my tech. Policy says, joint rounds once per hour. Accountability. When we reached bed 3, she was asleep. I remember feeling relieved. At 1:45, I did the round alone. She was awake again. Same position, same folded hands. She didn't speak this time, just watched me write. At 2 o'clock, the tech called in sick from the bathroom, vomiting. I sent him home, per protocol. That left just me until the float nurse finished meds upstairs. I documented modified observation status and continued rounds solo. Not ideal, but allowed. At 2:15, I checked bed 3. She said, "You forgot me earlier." I told her I hadn't. "You skipped," she said. "You stood in the hall and wrote instead." I felt irritation then, defensive irritation. I told her I had been right there. She shook her head slowly. "You didn't look at my feet," she said. I looked. Her feet were hanging just slightly off the mattress, not touching the bed. I adjusted them back without comment. Documented repositioned. At 2:30, I reviewed the log. The 2 o'clock round was missing, not blank deleted. The system showed it had been entered, then removed, by my login. I checked the audit trail. That feature is limited, but it showed a modification timestamp of 2:02. I had been in bed 7 at 2:02. I remembered because the patient snores loudly and I denoted it mentally. At 2:45, I didn't go in. I stood in the doorway and observed, per policy allowance. She was awake. Her eyes shifted to meet mine immediately. "You can't count that," she said. "You didn't come in." I felt heat rise behind my ears. I stepped fully into the room. She smiled again. "That's better," she said. At 3 o'clock, the float nurse arrived. I told her about the chart discrepancy. She reviewed the log and didn't see anything missing. She suggested fatigue. It wasn't unkind. At 3:15, we rounded together. Bed 3 was asleep. At 3:30, I checked alone. Awake. "You're tired now," she said. "That's when you stop seeing us properly." I asked her what she meant by us. She looked past me, toward the hallway. "The ones who don't move when you're not here," she said. At 4 o'clock, I requested a safety camera review for my own reassurance. The cameras cover the hallway, not inside rooms. But they would show my movement. Security pulled the footage later that morning. From 1:45 to 2:30, the camera showed me stopping at bed 3's doorway, standing there, writing, not entering. Not once. I still sign off on observation logs. I still believe in the system, but I no longer trust the feeling of having been somewhere, just because I remember doing my job. The only reason I remember the locker number is because it wasn't mine. I was covering an overnight float last-minute call-in, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. in a behavioral health pod I hadn't worked in years. Adolescent unit, 12 to 17. High supervision, low trust. You don't relax there, even when it's quiet. I was a mental health technician then. 8 years in, my job was eyes, hands, documentation. I didn't make diagnoses. I made sure no one hurt themselves while the clinicians slept. At 7:12 p.m., I was assigned locker 14 for the shift. Temporary lockers rotate with floats. No big deal. Inside was a folded sweatshirt, gray issued, not mine. I assumed the previous tech forgot it. I left it there. We're not supposed to move patient-adjacent items without logging it, and adolescent units are strict. The evening routine went as expected. Homework hour, medication line, showers, lights dimmed at 9:30. At 9:45, a patient in room 9 asked me if I'd worked last time. I told him no. He said, "You had the same locker though." I asked him how he knew that. He shrugged. "You always smell like that soap." I switched soaps a month earlier. Hospital supply change. At 10:30, I opened locker 14 to grab my clipboard. The sweatshirt was gone. In its place was a folded observation sheet. Handwritten, my handwriting, not copied habitual. The way I loop my Y's. The pressure on the pen. It listed room 9, room 11, room 6, 15-minute intervals, times from the previous night. I checked the date. It was yesterday's. I hadn't worked yesterday. I closed the locker and stood there longer than I should have. At 11 o'clock, I did rounds. Everything normal. At 11:15, room 9 was awake. Sitting on the bed, knees pulled in. "You're late," he said. I told him I wasn't. "You were supposed to check me before the dream," he said. I asked what dream. "The one where I stop moving but can still hear you," he said. "That one takes longer." I documented patient anxious. At 12 a.m., I checked the locker again. Another sheet. This one blank, except for a single line at the top. "Don't switch lockers." At 12:30, I asked the charge nurse if anyone had floated overnight before me. She said no. At 1 o'clock, I noticed my badge felt heavier. When I looked down, there was a laminated tag clipped behind it. Locker 14. I hadn't put it there. At 1:15, room 9 said, "You should sit tonight. You always stand when you're new." I asked him what he meant by always. He didn't answer. At 2 o'clock, I sat. I don't know why, fatigue maybe. Or habit I didn't remember forming. At 2:15, the unit felt settled. Not quiet, just arranged. Like everything was where it expected to be. At 2:30 I wrote an observation note and realized I was copying from memory, not of this shift, of another one. At 3 o'clock, I checked locker 14 again. Inside was my old ID badge. Expired. From 3 years earlier. I turned it over. On the back, in faded marker, was my signature. I didn't report it. At 6:45 a.m., handover arrived. I cleared my locker. It was empty. No sweatshirt, no papers, no badge. The charge nurse thanked me for picking up the shift again. I corrected her. She smiled politely. Right. First time back in a while. I don't float anymore, and I never take locker 14 because I learned something working that unit. Some routines don't belong to a single night. You're never supposed to say it out loud. But on the acute behavioral stabilization unit, the first 15 minutes after meds are given are called the window. It's the fragile period when the sedatives haven't fully gripped, but the agitation has been chemically blunted. You watch for paradoxical reactions. You watch for nothing. I was a mental health technician. My job was to sit in the dimmed observation room, behind the one-way glass, and log behavior every 5 minutes on the clipboard chart. Room 3 was occupied by a man we'll call Fisher, brought in on a 72-hour hold after he was found trying to methodically unplug every appliance in his apartment building's hallway, not angrily, with a terrifying focus. Diagnosis was pending. Rule out for OCD with severe intrusive thoughts, or early stage something else. He was verbal but vague. Polite. That night, at 21:30, he'd taken his 10 milligrams of Zyprexa without issue. I noted it on the log. Asterisk, 21:30 meds administered. PT compliant. Returns to bed. Lights low. Asterisk, I settled into the chair. The hum of the glass and the faint sound of the unit's air conditioning my only company. The log was simple. A grid with timestamps and boxes for notes. At 21:35, I noted, PT supine, eyes open, fixed on ceiling. At 21:40, no change, resp even, standard. The window was closing, he was settling. At 21:45, I lifted my pen. Fisher hadn't moved. His eyes were still open. Then, very slowly, he turned his head on the pillow. He wasn't looking around the room. He was looking directly at the observation window. At me. Not at the glass, but at the specific spot where I was sitting, in total darkness behind it. My hand froze. It's a known phenomenon. Sometimes patients sense the observation. They guess. The light hits just right. A dozen explanations. I waited for him to look away. He didn't. His gaze was placid, heavy-lidded from the meds, but unwavering. I wrote, asterisk 21:45. PT turns head, faces observation window, appears drowsy. Asterisk at 21:50. He was still looking, not blinking often. I felt a low heat at the back of my neck. I broke protocol. I leaned slowly to the left, a full 2 feet out of my usual position. His eyes didn't track me. They remained fixed on the spot I had vacated. Okay, I thought. He's staring at a smudge, a light reflection. He's not seeing me. He's just catatonic gazing. I returned to center. His eyes immediately shifted, locking onto mine again with a soft, chemical slowness. A coincidence. A trick of the light. I made the note. Asterisk 21:50 PT continues to face window. Possible visual fixation. Asterisk the next 5-minute check was at 21:55. I decided to test it, a foolish, unprofessional test. I stood up quietly and moved to the very far left corner of the observation room, a place no patient could possibly see into due to the angle. I peered through the glass. Fisher's head began to turn, with that same slow, drugged precision, following my progress across the room, until he was staring directly at me in the new corner. My breath caught. It was impossible. The geometry was impossible. The one-way glass was a solid, non-transparent mirror from his side. I was a ghost in a dark box. At 22 o'clock, the charge nurse did her round. I was back in my chair, my handwriting tight on the log. Fisher, as if sensing her presence in the hallway outside his door, slowly turned his head back to face the ceiling. He closed his eyes. He looked asleep. The nurse popped her head into the observation room. "Everything quiet?" "Yes," I said. My voice sounded fine. "Fisher's down." She nodded and left. I looked back at the log, at the 2145 entry. I had written exactly what I saw. But then I looked at the top of the form, at the header I'd filled out at the start of my shift. My name, the date, the unit, and the time I'd begun the log. Asterisk, 21 o'clock, asterisk, every 5 minutes. 21:05, las 9:10 de la noche. Las 9:15 de la noche. I'd been meticulous, but I'd started the log at the top of the hour. The first entry noting his turn toward the window was at 21:45. Fisher had no clock in his room. His personal belongings, including a watch, were secured in the property office. The wall his bed faced was blank. The sedation would have blurred any internal sense of time. Yet he had turned to stare at the exact center of the window at 21:45, not at 21:44 or 21:46. The first moment it became 21:45. I never wrote down the part about moving to the corner. I never mentioned the time fixation to the day staff. What would be the point? He was transferred to a long-term facility 3 days later. The diagnosis on his discharge summary was obsessive-compulsive disorder with psychotic features. Sometimes I think about that. They called it a feature, a symptom. I suppose that's what it was. But in my private, professional mind, where I keep the things I don't say, I have a different word for it. I call it measurement. I was on-call night staff that month, bouncing between units when census spiked. This shift put me in the high-acuity adult wing 4-point restraint-capable rooms, constant monitoring, everything by the book. I'd been in psychiatric facilities long enough to know that restraint documentation is sacred. You don't pre-fill it. You don't approximate. You don't get creative. It was 11:58 p.m. when I signed in. I remember because midnight resets the observation clock, and I like clean transitions. Room 2 was occupied. Male, early 50s, admitted from medical for severe depressive stupor with intermittent agitation. Not violent, but unpredictable. He'd been placed in soft restraints earlier in the evening after repeated attempts to get out of bed, despite hypotension. The outgoing nurse gave a careful report. Patient, minimally responsive. No verbalization, eyes open intermittently, no purposeful movement. When I sat at the desk to review the restraint flow sheet, the 12 a.m. entry was complete. Vitals charted, circulation checks documented. Range of motion noted as passive. All under my name. I assumed I'd opened the wrong chart. I closed it, reopened. Same thing. I checked the timestamp 11:59 p.m. 1 minute before I arrived on the unit. I told myself it was a system carryover. We'd been having sync issues. I added an addendum noting verified on arrival, and moved on. You learn not to chase every anomaly, or you'll never get through a shift. At 12:15, I went into room 2. He was awake. Eyes open, fixed straight ahead. I did the circulation check. Fingers warm, cap refill normal. He didn't react. I told him my name and that I'd be there all night. We're trained to orient, even if we don't expect a response. As I turned to leave, he said, quietly, "You already were." I stopped half in the doorway. I asked him what he meant. "You were here before the lights changed," he said. "You told me to keep breathing." That phrasing bothered me. Not dramatic, just precise. I asked him if he was in pain. "No," he said. "I just don't like when I can't tell who's counting." I documented the verbalization verbatim. No interpretation. At 12:30 I checked the log again. The 12:15 entry was filled out. I hadn't written it yet. The language matched mine. Even the shorthand. CRT to South. I used that exact abbreviation. Most staff don't. I felt heat rise behind my eyes. Not panic, more like the onset of a headache you know will last. At 12:45, I stayed in the room longer than required. I spoke aloud as I checked each restraint point, anchoring myself to the moment. He followed my voice with his eyes. "You don't have to narrate," he said. "You didn't last time." I asked him when last time was. He swallowed. It looked difficult. When I stopped answering, he said, "But you kept asking anyway." At 1 o'clock, the chart populated again. Full entry. My initials. I hadn't left the room. I checked the system audit trail. It showed active documentation from my login, even though my hands hadn't touched the keyboard. I called the charge nurse, told her something was off. She reviewed the chart from her station. She saw nothing unusual. At 1:15, I asked the patient if he knew why he was restrained. "So you don't leave," he said. I asked who. He looked at me for a long time before answering. "The part of you that keeps working," he said, "even when you're not here." At 1:30, he became hypotensive. Mild, but enough to require release per protocol. I called it. We removed the restraints. He didn't resist, didn't move at all once free. As soon as we finished, the restraint log closed itself. Final entry timestamped 1:29. Restraints discontinued. Patient calm, under my name. At 2 o'clock, he was asleep. Deeply. The kind of sleep you don't interrupt. At 4 o'clock, I checked the chart again. Every entry from midnight to 2 o'clock was present. Perfectly spaced. Perfectly written. I submitted no corrections. He was transferred to a medical floor later that morning. I never saw him again. But since that shift, I no longer trust completed documentation. If a chart looks too clean before I touch it, I start over. Because some nights taught me this. The body can be restrained, but attention doesn't always stay where you think you left it. The thing about the lithium levels is that the patients never know the number. It's just a blood draw, a vial sent to the lab, a result that appears in their chart, which they don't see. They might know if they're feeling the buzz of toxicity or the slump of insufficiency, but they don't know the digits. 0.6, 0.8, 1.2. It's clinical shorthand. I'd been a psychiatric nurse on the mood disorders unit for about 6 years. The overnight shift, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., often involved the 2 a.m. vital signs and medication rounds. You move quietly. You try not to fully wake them. We had a patient, Samara, bipolar I, rapid cycling. She'd been responding well to lithium, but her levels were finicky. We were adjusting. That week, she was on 900 milligrams. Her level from the Monday draw was 0.7 therapeutic, but on the lower end. The plan was to recheck on Thursday. It was a Wednesday night, or rather, very early Thursday morning, 2:20 a.m. I entered her room with the small paper cup holding her dose. The nightlight was on. She was sitting up in bed, already awake, which wasn't unusual for her. I handed her the cup and the water. "Here you go, Samara." She took it, but didn't swallow immediately. She looked at the pill, then at me. Her eyes were clear, not manic, not depressed, just present. "It's going to be high," she said, her voice quiet but even. "Sorry, the number tomorrow. From my blood, it's going to be high. 1.3. She put the pill in her mouth and took a drink. I remember forcing a professional, neutral expression. "We'll see what the lab says. Try to get some more sleep, okay?" I noted the time of administration on her MAR and left. It was a strange thing to say, but patients fixate on their meds, on dosages, on side effects. They hear the doctors talking. Maybe she'd overheard a conversation about the therapeutic range. 1.3 is at the upper edge, nearing toxicity. It was a plausible, if oddly specific, fear. The phlebotomist came at 9 o'clock in the morning, just before my shift ended. I didn't give it another thought until I came back that evening. The day shift nurse handed over the reports. She tapped Samara's lab printout. Lucky catch. Her lithium came back at 1.3. We held the evening dose. Doctors reducing it to 600. A cold, precise feeling settled in my stomach. Not dread. It was more like the feeling you get when you witness a perfect, impossible coincidence in a controlled environment. A flipped coin landing on its edge. I went about my duties. At 9 p.m., during evening meds, I saw Samara in the common area. She looked at me, and there was no triumph in her face. No, I told you so. There was nothing. It was the flat, knowing emptiness of someone who'd simply stated a fact about the world, and the world had complied. I never asked her about it. To ask would be to give the event a weight it didn't medically deserve. In her chart, the sequence was simple. Asterisk patient expressed concern about potential elevated serum level. Lab result, confirmed level of 1.3 mol. L dose, adjusted accordingly. Asterisk, it read like a piece of good patient self-awareness, a positive note. But I knew the tone. She hadn't expressed concern. She had stated a fact, a number, with the calm certainty of someone reading a train schedule. The horror isn't that she predicted it. The horror is in the documentation that followed. We had to write it up as a symptom of her illness, hypervigilance, somatic preoccupation, because the alternative that she simply knew a number that hadn't yet been measured in a lab 10 miles away isn't a valid clinical entry. So the truth of that moment, the chill of her certainty, exists only in the space between the official lines. It's the unchartable thing. And in this place, if it isn't charted, it never officially happened, but it did. And I have to carry the real version, while the paper carries the sane one. The last one is the reason I stopped doing nights. Not immediately. I finished the rotation, trained my replacement, gave the usual reason: sleep, family, burnout. But that wasn't it. It was something smaller and harder to explain. It was the handover note. I was working a split unit, then part observation, part step down, adults only, mixed acuity. I'd been a psychiatric nurse for just over 15 years. Nights again, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. I liked endings. I liked closing things cleanly. This happened near the end of my final night rotation. At 6:28 a.m., I started writing handover. That's earlier than required, but I like to leave time to review. The unit was settled. No incidents. No PRNs overnight. Everyone breathing. I opened the shared handover document. Most of it was already there. Not copied forward, that's obvious when it happens. This was written in present tense, referencing the night that hadn't ended yet. Patient in bed for slept intermittently after 3 o'clock. That was true. Bed 2 continues to request reassurance, but remained in room, also true. Then I saw the line that didn't belong. Staff member took extended time in room 1 at 2:40. No intervention required. I stared at it. We don't document staff like that. Ever. Not in handover. Not unless something goes wrong. I scrolled up to see who authored the note. No author listed. I checked the version history. The entry appeared at 6:12 a.m. I was in the medication room at 6:12. I remembered because I'd checked the fridge temperature twice, distracted. I read the line again. Room 1. Room 1 had been empty all night. At least that's what I believed. I went back through the observation log. Room 1 was marked vacant every 15 minutes. My initials. Correct times. At 6:35, I did one last round before day staff arrived. Habit. Closure. When I reached room 1, the door was closed. I stopped. Vacant rooms don't get closed. Doors stay open so you can see they're empty. I opened it slowly. The room was empty. Bed stripped. Mattress bare. No chair, no trash. Like it had never been used. I stood there longer than required. Enough to notice the faint indentation on the mattress shoulder width. Fresh. At 6:45, day shift arrived. We sat at the desk. I gave report verbally. Nothing unusual. I didn't mention the handover note. When the day nurse opened the document, She frowned. Did you mean to leave this line in? She asked. I asked her which one. She read it aloud. Staff member took extended time in room 1 at 2:40. No intervention required. I told her I hadn't written it. She nodded slowly. Okay, I'll delete it. Before she did, she added a comment beneath it. Neutral, routine noted. She saved and closed the file. As I stood to leave, she said, casually, by the way, did you ever figure out why room 1 kept getting checks logged last week? I asked her what she meant. She shrugged. IT said it was just residual data. But it happened again last night. Looks like someone was consistently present. I didn't answer. I handed in my badge 10 minutes later. I still think about that note sometimes, not because of what it said, but because of what it implied. That even when we believe a space is empty, even when we sign off that nothing happened, there may still be a record insisting that someone was there, and that the system expects us to account for it. That's what finally made me stop.